Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we're going to be talking about the psychology of identity related to two groups of individuals identified as American Indians, also known as First Nations. We are going to be talking a little bit about a little-known group of individuals who were enslaved indigenous people. What's interesting is that this particular group was enslaved by another group also identified as Indigenous or First Nation or American Indian. Now, the one American Indian group might sound more familiar to people than the other group that we're going to talk about. As a matter of fact, this group is really a little known group, particularly in Northern America, south of Canada. There's another question that comes up with looking at all of this, and that question is the extent to which individuals who have historically identified as American Indian, Native American, Indigenous American, there's a question about the extent to which those individuals are actually indigenous, or whether or not they were actually transplanted, and the true identity being Eurasian African or African Eurasian or some variation thereof, mixed with the indigenous people or supplanting the indigenous people. And if this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Now, this is a very unusual dynamic here. The name of this Indian tribe, this indigenous group of people, is slave, also known as slavey. They are part of the Dene Indian tribe, Indian group of people, indigenous people, pretty much occupying Canada. And so the interesting thing is they were given this name by the Cree nation, who used to plunder and enslave many of them. And so they gave them this name of slave or slavey. And then the French and English just sort of took this on and continued using this name for this particular group of people. Now, they were known by slave, not just because they had been enslaved, but because they had a reputation for being very timid and being very passive. And here you can see some additional notations related to the slave Indian tribe. They were inhabitants of the riverbanks and the forests in Canada. And so you can see additional information about how they lived, what they hunted, where they lived, and basically little things about their culture. And here you see in the Canadian Encyclopedia this depiction of the slave Indian tribe, and you see this is a slavey Indian camp, and it says the date is unknown, and this is in the Archives of Canada. We're going to see some additional depictions also. And here you can see additional notations related to the slavey or slave Indian group, the Dene people. You see information about exactly where they are located in the Western Canadian subarctic. You can stop the video and actually read this. And here you can see that not only is there a group of people going by the name slave, this is not to say that this is a name that they gave themselves. This, of course, is a name that came from another group of people. However, there is also a waterway. There's a river in Canada going by the same name, which is the Slave River. And here you see additional depictions of individuals identified as slave people. And you can see also in French that it's spelled slave also. And here you see additional depictions of people identified as slaves. One interesting notation is that there's archaeological evidence to suggest that this particular region in Canada had been inhabited since at least 3000 BC. And so again, the question comes up about who these actual people were. One of the things you have to be careful about is the identities of people changing after contact with colonizers or settlers. And this dynamic took place not only in the Americas, this is the same dynamic that took place in Africa and also in other parts of the East. And so there would be a dynamic of contact, and then the groups would mix and merge, and the identities would get a little murky. And so you have to be kind of careful about that. And sometimes you have these late contact groups. And when you see those late contact groups, they didn't make contact until the 1700s. That's kind of a suspicious contact. And what that might be indicative of is an actual group that migrated from Europe, Africa, Asia, and then took on an indigenous identity. And here you have information related to treaties and this particular group. You see a notation related to initial European contact occurring with some groups, 1789. That's an extremely late contact. When you're talking about from 1492 to 1789 and not making contact until 1789, that's a really late period of time. And again, what might be possible is that these are not sometimes indigenous groups, but perhaps groups of individuals in some instances, not saying that this is definitely the case for this group of people, but in some instances what you might have going on is transplanting of groups from Eurasia, Africa, into the Americas, and then those individuals, those groups, doing what's known as going native, or mixing and merging with other groups, or sometimes taking on the identity of groups that actually might be extinct. And so that's important to note when you are seeing these late contact situations. And here's a quick depiction of a Cree Nation chief known as Poundmaker, also known as Peacemaker. What's interesting is the hairstyle. And as you will note, if you can look very closely, this particular chief is sporting locks. Now, we've quickly looked at this little known group of indigenous people, Indian people, American Indian people, First Nation people, going by this unusual moniker, ethnonym of slaves and slavey. What's interesting also about this is that you have another Indian, indigenous, First Nation group actually being the enslavers, and this is distinct from, purportedly distinct from, any European enslaving of these people. Now, again, what you need to make note of is this dynamic of late contact, and also the possibility that in some instances you're not necessarily talking about Indian groups, but you might be talking about Eurasian, African, Eurasian groups of people migrating and then quote unquote going native and taking on those identities. What's also interesting to note is with all of the rhetoric about the slavery narrative not being a correct one, for there to actually be a group of American Indians known as slaves, it's a very interesting dynamic and definitely something that people should explore a little bit more. What was really going on with this group of people? How did they really come to have this identity? Who were these actual enslavers, and who were the enslaved people when they first acquired this particular unusual name? There are so many people, such a diverse group of people identifying as American Indian, and the numbers continue to grow. And one of the things that people need to get a handle on is the extent to which you are talking about indigenous people, or the extent to which you are talking about people who may have been early comers, early migrants who actually took on that identity. In other words, masquerading as Indians, so masking Indians of sorts. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.